Stuart Holman here for Growing Disciples. Welcome to a new week of daily devotionals. This week, doing a bit of a deep dive into the Last Supper. Last week we followed Mark's account of Jesus' final week in Jerusalem, introducing really the climax of his earthly ministry. At the end of that week, now recorded for us in great detail by John's Gospel, Jesus gathers the 12 for a final meal together, the Last Supper. The first few verses of John chapter 13 set the scene for us. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. The hour has come. Several times before in John's Gospel we've been told that the hour is not yet, but now the hour has come. Just before the Passover festival, that annual reminder of God's saving of Israel out of Egypt, which included this kind of reenactment meal. The whole household would gather around a meal which included a lamb sacrificed and roasted, just as it had been done on that final night in Egypt. During that meal, the head of the household would, in several parts, retell the story and remind his family of God's salvation actions back then, even as they anticipated God's future salvation. All the other things are in place for Jesus. His betrayal, it's all set up. He's empowered by God. All things are under his power. And Jesus knows his destination. He is returning to God through the cross. So the theme of the meal turns on salvation. But not salvation through the Egyptian Passover, but salvation through the service of Jesus. Verse 4, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, you have no part in me. Then Lord, Simon replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said, not every one was clean. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Let's think for a moment or two about what Jesus is saying through this enacted prophecy. He's quite deliberately saying something which was introduced for us at the end of verse 3 there. His feet washing is an enacted prophecy of that kind that interprets and foretells what is just about to happen. Jesus has come from the Father, emptying himself of all his divine glory, taking off those wonderful garments, and instead putting on the outward appearance of a servant. The incarnation is pictured by just a towel wrapped around his body. And as he washes the filth and the dirt of his disciples' feet from the streets of Jerusalem, we can just imagine all of the muck and the filth being transferred to that towel, which seems to represent Jesus' body. And as Jesus approaches Peter, and Peter initially refuses, we learn of the essential nature of this cleaning that Jesus is picturing for them here. The literal water in the towel being used by Jesus, of course, just pictures for the cross. Peter will have no part in Jesus if he's not included in Jesus' death on the cross. Being joined to Jesus by faith as he goes to the cross is essential for all cleansing from sin. To round out the enacted prophecy, Jesus puts his clothes back on, that is, in his resurrection and ascension, he resumes his former glory and he returns to his place, his rightful place at the right hand of the Father. So now, resuming his rightful place of honour, Jesus turns to the teaching moment. He's just demonstrated what the cross is all about. He's about to use his body to wash away sin. But there's more for the disciples. They are also to do something in response. The example of the cross means something for their lives. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asks them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Do we understand what Jesus has done for us? I wonder what foot washing might look like for us in our culture today. What's its cultural equivalent? Perhaps more importantly, how might we adopt the mindset of a servant as Jesus shows us? Of course, we don't serve all humanity by dying on a cross, but it seems at very least that following Jesus is going to begin with giving up our ambitions and our rights and our privileges in order to serve. The thing I keep coming back to with Jesus' illustration here is that he insists on washing Peter's feet. Perhaps Peter's protest arises from arrogance. It's a strange kind of pride wherein we won't allow Jesus to wash us. And yet Jesus insists on including Peter within the scope of the cross. Perhaps sitting next to Peter, there's also someone else who Jesus also kneels before in a servant's towel, washing his feet, taking the role of the lowest of slaves. By this time, Jesus knows what Judas is about to do, yet he still washes his feet. Jesus' death is sufficient even for the traitor and the deceiver if they will turn back to him. There is no sin, no pride, no arrogance, no betrayal that Jesus refuses to wipe clean with his body. Of course, not all do turn back to him to seek his forgiveness, but if they would, Jesus' death is sufficient. The second half of John 13 develops the role of Judas as traitor. Old Testament prophecies are brought to the reader's mind as Jesus not only washes his feet, but shares his final meal with Judas, his betrayer. Finally, as he dismisses him, Jesus says, "What you're about to do it quickly." And then he turns to his disciples, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You look for me, but just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Just as Jesus loved his disciples, not just in the foot washing, but at the crucifixion to which the foot washing symbolically refers, in this same way that Jesus loved us, we are to love each other. And this so-called golden rule takes on even greater significance, doesn't it, in this original context? Just as Jesus has loved us, we are to love one another. And in so doing, the world recognises us as belonging to Jesus. I leave these thoughts for your reflection and your prayer.